I guess I should start off by introducing myself first. My name is Tanya Gilly, and I will be the moderator for this session. And we will start off with Ambassador Luqman Faili. Ambassador Luqman has been Iraq's ambassador to Washington, D.C. since 2013. Before that, he actually served as ambassador of Iraq to Japan for 3 years. Next will be speaking Dr. Brendan O'Leary. Dr. Brendan is a Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He has authored and co-authored about 20 books, and he has worked as advisor to, or he has served as advisor to the European Union, to the United States government, and to the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq and the UK. And the British Labour Party. So he's given advice, especially on power sharing and what's the word I'm looking for? Federalism and confederalism. And he actually got his BA honors from the University of Oxford in philosophy, politics, and economics. And his PhD thesis won the Robert Mackenzie Memorial Prize at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, and thanks for being in Kurdistan. And last but not least, we will have Mr. Farhad Alauddin. Mr. Farhad Alauddin is the political advisor to Iraq's president, Dr. Fuad Massoum. Prior to his post as political advisor in Baghdad, he served as chief of staff from 2009 to 2011 to the prime minister at the time. And after that, for 2 years, he served as advisor to the prime minister. Mr. Farhad Alauddin is an avid writer of Iraqi politics and Kurdish politics, and he has a master's degree in leading innovation and change from York St. John University. Welcome, and we will start with Mr. Faili.
Okay. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. First of all, I would like to thank MERI for giving me an opportunity, although they informed me yesterday about it. It was difficult for me to try to articulate what are the key issues which this audience want to hear, which they have not either covered or may not have a perspective on because of the type of speakers they are. So my talk is not one of representative of the government, but one who views the government, is part of the government, and somebody from outside viewing, who lives outside, who interacts with Iraq and is being tasked with selling the project of Iraq to the world. More so, selling it in a very sophisticated environment of the United States. People tell me, when they ask me what's my job, when I say I'm an ambassador in Washington, the first comment they have is, you have a tough job. You have an unthankful job in a sense of you have contradicting requirements from your stakeholders, from your government, from officials, from communities in Iraq. Try to make sense of that to our American friends, and international is not an easy task. It is doable, but we need to sometime go back to the basic of understanding what is the Iraq project post-2003. Yesterday, my colleague or my friend, Dr. Barham Saleh, talked about the failure of that project. Today, I will try to not contradict that, but say that that project is still outstanding. We cannot kill it because I think there has a lot of lively element to it. We should certainly revive it in a healthier way and in a mature way. There is no sense in saying that nations have to survive all the time. You will say what evolution of states, because they are organic, means that they have to go through various life cycles. It's in our hand how do we want to transform that life cycle. So trying to view Iraq from our side, specifically from the United States, is not what you might call a rosy picture. The United States themselves had a certain view of Iraq, certain view of the region back in 2003, and now, 12 years thereafter, they are retrospectively looking at it and saying, where did we go wrong? What was the issues? How could we fix it? Can it be fixed? And certainly the key question we Iraqis need to focus on at this important moment is not just to support what can we get in relation to the fight against Daesh, but it's what are the key questions we want to our American friends to raise in their next election cycle. Without raising the right questions, unfortunately, the narrative which my colleagues or my friend Ken Pollack talked about will be strengthened, which is this is a failed project. We as Iraqis, even if we believe that this project was not as rosy as it is or should be, we certainly have an obligation in trying to make sense of it and moving forward. We are an integral part of this project. We are not partners to it. We are not the people who can interact with it, but people who live this project. As to do that, we need to come up with initially what I might call a shared vision. I mean, here we got I think the title of this is, sharing visions. To share that vision, which is a prerequisite for dialogue, we need to have an understanding as what is that vision can look like. To do that, we need a dialogue. To do the dialogue, we need to come up to some shared understanding as to the terminologies, as to the obligation, as to the language of the dialogue, as to understand each other's position, as to we both have to agree something, we need to move forward. These are all prerequisites for a dialogue to take place. They are not important, they are essential, because the alternative to that is a bloody, an instability, a conflict in a region which is by its own nature, for the last at least decades, has been one of trouble to the globe, one of essence and one of importance to the globe as well. So this is inevitable. The oil curse, the geography curse, the Sunni Shia curse, call it what you like. At the end of the day, these are important features of your society which we have to live with. How do we do that? That's in our hand. To do that, there are certain narratives which we have to resolve. We have to, before that, we need to, what I call engagement or terms of engagement into our references for our dialogue to take place. Or let's call it rule of engagement. First one is we need to have some red lines defined in our politics, where everybody agrees this is a red line. For example, terrorism is unaccepted, should be a red line. Destruction of the state should be a red line. At this moment, when as an Iraqi, when I view my own politics, I don't see a lot of red lines. And that in itself is a first problem. Second, a concept of closure has to be agreed on. At this moment, everything is leave it to time. I don't want to address these issues. Maybe some other time. Well, time in itself is a factor which can influence a tribal society, which means revenge and other features are an integral part of that. We need to get away from it. So we need to define a closure to the issues. We cannot have open-ended issues all the time. So that's another issue. A third issue is we need to all have some key understanding of where do we want to be in the times ahead. What are the key visions which we can all agree on? And that's not an easy task. We have to admit mistakes so that we let others admit their mistake. That's not an easy task. At this moment, everybody is at fault and I'm right. That mentality is substantially misleading and counterproductive. Baghdad is a problem, and that fix Baghdad, everything gets fixed. KRG is a problem, fix Baghdad. This is not the right approach to it. So in that sense, we need to relook at our politics. The culture of politics we have created is one of not negative, but toxic. And it's certainly self-destructing. And here I'm talking about not as a Kurd or a Shia or somebody from an Islamic party. No, I'm talking about somebody from outside view the politics. We're trying to ask the United States to help us and other European countries. To do that, at this moment, they see us as a divided country with a sole objective of destroying each other. And in the midst of that, we're destroying our heritage, those who are in the minorities and human rights and others as well. This is the image we're projecting to the outside world. We have the responsibility to fix. We may have certain narratives which we need to address, which is the rule of engagement, which is to do with the conspiracy theory. Even if there is a conspiracy, even if there is, you have to do something to impact it and to reverse it. By admitting it and by giving up on it, you're more or less saying, I have no influence and nature will take its course. And in the current projection of this country, where we are now, and this country I do mean within the borders of Iraq, is that we are on at the track in the wrong direction. When people tell me, well, we are not far off where we will have conflicts, where we'll have a peace or other scenarios, I say, you need to take a break and view it from outside. We are in the midst of that. We are in the eye of the storm. Destruction of the state, destruction of communities are already taking place by the wrong culture being promoted in our politics. We need to move away from that. We need to grow up from that aspect of it. That destruction may not have been caused by us, may have been American miscalculation of Iraq. I can give you tons of reasons. Maybe a legacy of dictatorship on society. Yes, nobody says that. But who takes ownership of your problems? You expect the United States? They are clearly saying we have national interest in our region, and we have to look after that. Talk about Iran, talk about others, everybody looks after themselves. As a nation state, as communities who take ownership of our issues, for us to view the situation that we are moving in the right direction, or that all we need is to fix this small issue or that small issue, then I'm saying that we are certainly moving in the wrong direction. We need to have a common vision, define that vision, agree on rule of engagements, agree on certain basic issues. The relationship now we have between our communities is one of transaction. It's no longer strategic. That's something that people have to admit. But transactions mean confidence has to be built to strengthen it and make it strategic. We, at this moment, are in the wrong directions of history. You have the European communities, you have TPP, you have other, which all says we need to build an interdependent relationships. At this moment, we are seeking independent at the cost of interdependent, and this is a self-destruction. And I will finish there, and I hope later on to cover some of the other issues.
Of course. Thank you so much, Ambassador Luqman. Professor O'Leary, who will be speaking at the podium.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be back in the Kurdistan region. I'd like to give my grateful thanks to MERI and to Dr. Dilar Al-Aladin. It's an honor to speak with you. 10 years ago, slightly more, I was part of Kurdistan's advisory team in the making of the Constitution of Iraq of 2005. I'd like to begin with a piece of political science. The average life of a constitution across the world is the same as a teenager, a 17-year-old teenager. Iraq's constitution officially is 10 years old. In my view, it's not going to make being a teenager. In fact, I'm going to provide a preliminary coroner's report on the Constitution of 2005. And I'd like to say there was nothing in particular wrong with the text. And I think that Kurdistan achieved substantively what it sought from the Constitution of 2005. Its failures are primarily one of implementation. What remains of the Constitution of 2005 is intermittent elections, punctuated by intermittent bargaining and the kind of pious talk about the importance of shared visions. So I'm going to be bleak, and then I intend to provide some options for the future. The first failure of the Constitution is the failure to fulfill the federal commitments in the Constitution. The Constitution envisaged an Iraq made up of regions. There's still only one region. Both Shiite efforts to establish regions and Sunni efforts to establish regions have been blocked by successive prime ministers. And they've been blocked both legally and illegally and improperly. So, as a result, there's a completely unbalanced federation in which Kurdistan is the only region, and needless to say, Kurdistan's regional rights have not been fully respected, to put it mildly. And even then, the governorate's rights, which were built into the Constitution if governorates chose not to be regions, they had express rights, including the rights to be continually consulted over the management of natural resources, which were no longer to be an exclusive federal responsibility. So the program of federalization, as envisaged in particular by the principal negotiators, the Kurds and the lead party from the federal government, ISKI, that program has not been achieved. Secondly, the natural resources provisions of the Constitution have not been implemented. Those provisions quite plainly envisaged empowering the regions and governorates and having a weak federal government. And yet, what we have today is a centre which still formally relies on Saddam Hussein's oil and gas laws, which still imagines that the federal government owns Iraq's natural resources, when the Constitution expressly deprived the federal government of any ownership rights in this domain and obligated the federal government to co-share managerial responsibilities with the governorates in the regions, and granted to regions the rights to develop and exploit and have their own independent oil policies. And that, of course, is a way of saying that Kurdistan's rights as a region with respect to natural resources to this day have not been formally respected. And related, of course, to the failure to implement the natural resources provisions are the failures to have a budgetary allocation per year that corresponds to what the Constitution expressly mandated. We have a federal government that basically decides what it thinks is the federal share of revenues and leaves the rest to be allocated on an ad hoc basis per annum, not according to a per capita formula, carefully calculated according to the provisions in the Constitution. The third failure of federalism is the complete failure to establish two of the key institutions programmed in the Constitution, namely a federal Supreme Court and a second chamber. Now, people are always surprised when I say the federal Supreme Court. The federal Supreme Court that we have in Iraq is the leftover federal Supreme Court established in the transitional arrangements. The new federal Supreme Court was supposed to be established on the basis of a 2/3 law to be passed by the Council of Representatives. We don't have that. So you don't have a legitimate Supreme Court capable of resolving differences over the division of powers or over the meaning of key texts in the Constitution. You rely from time to time on a court with an expired mandate. And of course, there's no federal second chamber. So point number one, the federal project is severely damaged, if not completely disrespected. The second set of key failures of the Constitution of 2005 to be implemented might be summarized in a heading which refers to the failure to respect democratic processes and core rights embedded in the Constitution. If we take the rules on government formation, nobody today can tell me whether the rule is that the the first person who gets the chance to form a cabinet is the person from the largest bloc, the largest list, or the largest party. And in fact, the court and practice has given us two separate answers. A completely unacceptable position when you have a deeply divided place and where no party is likely to command on its own a majority in government. No prime minister, secondly, has presided over collegial cabinets. Each prime minister, by the way, no one should envy the job of being Prime Minister of Iraq. If you can think of a job more guaranteed to generate permanent paranoia, I'd welcome advice on that. But the Prime Minister of Iraq, perhaps for those reasons, has never presided over a collegial power-sharing cabinet that would be necessary for Iraq to function as a democratic and multinational federation. The independent public bodies established under the Constitution have all been suborned. The Central Bank, the Electoral Commission, the Commission on Public Integrity, just to name some of them. No one describes Iraq as a country governed by the rule of law. There are politicized indictments, there's mass internment, the human rights provisions in the Constitution in large parts of Iraq, not, I would say, in Kurdistan, are largely dead letters. There is massive corruption. That's all I need to say. And from a democratic point of view, key arbitrary changes were made in institutional arrangements, notably the electoral system. Most Kurds don't appreciate the fact that changes made to the electoral system lead to the underrepresentation of Kurdistan in the federal parliament, because Kurdistan does not benefit from the fact that its voters turn out in much higher numbers. Instead, Kurdistan is disproportionately underrepresented in the Iraqi parliament. The third key failure of the Constitution is the absolute failure of both sets of transitional provisions. And we can think of the provisions of Article 140 as intended largely to satisfy Kurds. They were intended to resolve the disputed territories, not just Kirkuk, everywhere from northern Nineveh through to Hanakeen. Those provisions were supposed to have been resolved by December 2007. They have obviously not been resolved. But there were also a set of transitional provisions in Article 142 that were largely intended to assuage Sunni Arab concerns. Those negotiations over those provisions actually took place, but the relevant items were never tabled for constitutional amendment. So in all these respects, there's been a comprehensive failure of the Constitution of 2005. So where are we? We're in a status quo where Iraq has one acknowledged open civil war and several potential civil wars. There is a collapsed federal army. I think it's the third time that the federal army has collapsed, but I've lost count. And by and large, the core interests of the federal government are now, in a military sense, provided by separate Shia militia who are combined for the purposes of a temporary fight against ISIS. There's a fiscal collapse at the center, and there are remarkable things that you would not expect as an outsider. At least until recently, I believe, the federal government was attempting to pay salaries of those in Mosul, occupied by ISIS. And at the very same time, the very same federal government was depriving Kurdistan, its ally against ISIS, of its legitimate budgetary entitlement. This is a federal center in desperate condition, wanting to preserve dependency relationships. In one case, by keeping the money going, in the other case, by trying to provide no money. So this is a really unacceptable status quo. So what are the options going forward? I have suggested, almost by definition, that the status quo is not a viable alternative. It's neither desirable nor credible. And no Kurdish leadership worthy of the name can accept that the Constitution of 2005 has worked. I think the motto that should be attached to every Kurdish delegation that goes to Baghdad should be as follows: Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. At the very best, we can say that the Constitution of 2005 gave Kurds an opportunity to build the institutions of statehood, which until very recent times I think they had made major progress in doing. But I think it's impossible to go forward with the project of the Constitution of 2005. To make it credible, Kurdistan would have to insist on a range of constitutional amendments to remove any allegations of ambiguity and lack of clarity. But to do so would require a constitutional amendment process which Kurdistan made sure would be extremely difficult to accomplish. So I think it's unlikely that we can see a way forward through a process of constitutional amendment. So what's the second option, at least for Kurdistan? The second and obvious option is to go for independence. Independence is in the heart of every Kurd. It's a project made viable by your institution building over the last 12 years and arguably back until 1991. And you have a legal case for doing so. The Constitution of Iraq was defined in its preface as a voluntary union of land and people. The contract in that constitution has been broken. I've just outlined the basis for saying that the constitution the contract has been violated. But the project of independence is difficult. Leaving aside internal disunity inside the Kurdistan region, and that's leaving aside a big matter, there are major difficulties when you become independent in achieving recognition. You need, above all, recognition from Baghdad. You need recognition from the neighbors. You need to agree a division of assets and liabilities with your Iraqi partners in the process of achieving independence. And, of course, you need to resolve questions related to boundaries. So independence, though desirable, isn't easy. Is there any halfway house? I would argue there is, and that it's of benefit both to the rest of Iraq and to Kurdistan. The halfway house is to go for confederation. In a confederation, the territorial exterior structure of what was Iraq would remain the same, but the relationship between Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq would change. Kurdistan would be an independent sovereign state which has chosen to confederalize its relationship with the rest of Iraq. For this to work, it would require a treaty. Interestingly, Barham Saleh said yesterday that he envisaged that the Constitution of 2005 was dead, and what was required was some kind of short documentary agreement between Kurdistan and Baghdad. I agree, but I don't think there should be some simple text with a little bit of bargaining. I think it should be a full-scale treaty, a treaty in which Baghdad recognizes Kurdistan as a sovereign state, and Kurdistan voluntarily enters into a confederation with the rest of Iraq, in which they share a common external defense policy. I think that's a viable option. It, of course, requires partners in Baghdad for this project to go ahead. In my view, the wise course for Kurdistan is to go and argue for confederation. You've been in an extremely bad marriage. You've been battered by successive husbands under the monarchy, under the republic, under the new federal and democratic Iraq of 2005. You should have no faith in these people as husbands. There's reason to be sympathetic for them too. Not all Iraqis were complicit in the multiple dictatorships that have characterized their history. So I do not want to, in some Orientalist fashion, imply that all Arab Iraqis are equally guilty. But nevertheless, Kurdistan must break free of its current constraints, and this is the moment to do so. I look forward to being interrogated according to human rights standards and democratic practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor O'Leary. I think your task is going to be a difficult one after that presentation. We will hear what Mr. Farhad Alaeddin will have to say about the unity of Iraq. And first of all, maybe you can tell us if Iraq will stay united or not, and then the reasons why you think so.
Okay, well, it's if the IT doesn't work, but good morning. Clearly, Tanya Khan said the session will be in English, but I'm going to speak in my native language, in Kurdish, and for the benefit of those who don't understand, if you please give them the headsets in the front, also here, as they don't have بياني باش بالتأكيد مسألة مانوي عراق بيك بارتسي أو خد دابجبوني يعني يكك موضوع هرقرنگ كاني لكردستان بتايبتي زور باسي لو ذكريه بلام آية بشويشي عاطفي تماشای دكين يا خد با شوازيشي واقعيانه أويك تعاملي لقر دكين بيوستا معاملي لقر بكريه بۆم بەستا ڕەنگە لێرە پێویستە تەماشایەکی واقعی ئێستای عێراق بکەین بزانین ئێمە لەکوێین ئایا عێراق یەک پارچەیە یاوە خود دابەش بووە خەڵکێکی زۆر هەیە کە دەڵێ عێراق بەتەئکید دابەش بووە بەڵام ئەگەر تەماشاکەین لە سەرەوەی عێراق کە هەرێمی کوردستانە تقریباً بە شێوەیەکەوە هەرێمی کوردستان تا ڕادەیەک سەر بەخۆیە ئەگەرچی لە ناو چوارچێوەی حدودی عێراق ئیش دەکاتن زۆربەی هەر زۆری کارەکانی هەرێمی کوردستان بەسەر بەخۆیی دەکرێتن لەو وەختەی ئێستا تەنانەت مەسلەی نەوتیش کە هەناردەکردنی نەوت بوو ئەوەش توانیان کە ئێستا بە مباشری خۆیان نۆت دەفرۆشن بەشەکی یەک لەسەر سێ عێراق داگیر کراوە لەلایەن داعش کە لەژێر کۆنتڕۆلی حکوومەتی بەغدانیە و بەشەکەی تریشی کەوە حکوومەتی فدرال ئیشی لەسەر دەکاتن ئەو خود لەژێر کۆنتڕۆلیتی ئەنجا لەواقع دەتوانین بڵێن کەوە عێراق دابەش بووە بەڵام لە چوارچێوەی دەوڵەتێکی فدرالدایە لە هەمان کات من پێویستم بە ئەوەیەکی ئیش بکاتن کە نۆتەکانم لەسەر لە هەمان کات ئایا دابەش بووە دەتوانی بڵێ نە دابەشیش نەبووە 100% یعنی کەواتە وەزعی عێراق لە شێوازێکی زۆر تایبەتدایە کە دەتوانین بڵێن نە دابەش بووە نە یەک پارچەشە ئەوە ژوای کردێکەوە عێراق بە شێوەیەکی تایبەت دەتوانێت بڵێ حالەتێکی خاصی هەبی یونیک پۆزیشن بەڵام با بێنە سەرەوەی لە باتوێ بڵێن ئایا عێراق یەکگرتووبی تەحەدای یەکگرتنەوەی عێراق با باسی تەحەدایەکانی پارچەبوونی عێراق بکەین یەکەم شت پارچەبوونی عێراق وەختی خۆی کە لە 100 ساڵ پێش ئێستا لە سایکس پیکۆ ئەو منتەقەیان بەش کرد یەکێک هەبوو کە دەبوایە ئەو منتەقەیە بەشکە کەواتە چێ دەیەوێ عێراق بەش بکە و لە هەمان کات بۆ دەیەوێ عێراق بەش بکە ئەنجا عێراق بیا دەوروبەرەکەی بی و ئەگەر گەیشتی نەتیجە لەگەرە دوو پرسیارە چۆن عێراق بەش دەکەین لەسەر ئەو ئەساسە با بینە سەرەوەی چێ دەیەوێ عێراق بەش بکە لەو وەختەی ئێستا کە باسی دەوڵەتی عوزما دەکەین سوپەر پاوەرەکان دەکەین هیچ کامێک لە وڵاتەکانی نە ئەمریکا نە رووسیا نە ئەوروپا کەس باسی ئەوەی نەکردو کە عێراق پارچەبی هەمووی لە هەموو خیتابە ڕەسمیەکانیان کە دێن لەگەر وفودی عێراقی دادەنیشن لەگەر وفودی کوردی دادەنیشن لە مؤتەمەرەکانی دەرەوە باسی دەکەن هەمووی باسی یەکپارچەیی خاچی عێراق دەکەن ئەگەر بینە سەر وڵاتانی دەوروبەر تورکیا ئێران سعودی هیچ کامەچیان ڕازی نەبووە تا ئێستا و باسیشی ئەوەی نەکردو کە ڕازی دەبی لەسەر دابەشبوونی عێراق بە تایبەتی تورکیا و ئێران کەوە ئەوان لە مەسلحەتیان نییە کوردستان بە تایبەتی بێزگە لە بەشەکانی تری عێراق دابەش ببی کەواتە ئەوان پێیان باش نییە کە عێراق دابەش ببی ئەگەر بینە سەر وڵاتانی عەرەبی کە عێراق بەشێکە لە وڵاتانی عەرەبی هیچ کام لە وڵاتانی عەرەبیش ڕازی نەبووە و پێی باش نییە لە پەیامیشیان نییە کەوا عێراق دابەش ببی. بینە ناوەوەی عێراق کورد ڕەنگە ئەوەی کە زۆری کە ئەگەر گوێمان لە دابەشبوونی عێراق بی ڕەنگە سەربەخۆی کوردستانە. من خۆم وەکو کوردێک ڕەنگە خەون و ئاواتم ئەوە بی کە ڕۆژێک لە ڕۆژان کوردستان بە سەربەخۆی بینم کە بتوانین کورد وڵاتی خۆی هەبی. بەڵام ئەوڕۆ هەتا لە حەزەی ئێستا ئەم قسەی لێ دەکەم پەیامی سیاسی کوردی هەموو حیزبەکان بەبێ ئەکسەپشن کەسیان باسی لە سەربەخۆی کوردستان نەکردووە. هیچ کامەچیان نەهاتوون مەشروعێکی سەربەخۆی کوردستان بڵاو بکەنەوە. تەنانەت دەتوانم بڵێم حتا منظماتی مجتمعی مەدەنیش نەبووە تا ئێستا پرۆژەی سەربەخۆی کوردستانی تەقدیم کردبی. بۆیە کە باسی سەربەخۆی کوردستان دەکەین پێویستە بڵێن کام سەربەخۆی کوردستان چێ تەقدیمی کردیە. ئەگەر بێ باسی سوننە بکەین سوننەکان هەر نەک هەر لەگە سەربەخۆی سوننە نین کە دەینە سەر تۆزێک تەفسیلتر ژێر سەر باسی سوننە. سوننە خۆیان لەگەر حکوومەتی ئیقلیمی سوننەش نەبووینە زۆربەی هەرە زۆریان چونکە ئەوان بە شێوێکی زۆر قەومیانە و زۆر عاتفیانە تەماشای عێراق دەکەن و یەک پارچەی عێراقیان دەوێت. طبعاً شیعە خۆیانەوە حاکمی وڵاتن ئەوان زۆربەی هەرە زۆریان دژ بەوەن کەوا عێراق پارچەبی چونکە پێویستیان بەوەیە کەوا شیعەکان لە کۆنتڕۆڵن جیان لێ نییە لۆیە ئەوان ئەگەر هەموو عێراقیان هەبی بۆ بیانەوەی عێراق پارچەکەن. ئەوانش ئەگەر بینە سەرەوەی بۆچی عێراق پارچە بێ ڕەنگە هەندێک قسە هەیە لەسەر مەسلەی اقتصادی من شخصیان نابینم کە سبەبی اقتصادی سبەبێک بی لە بۆ پارچەکردنی عێراق. بەنسبەت وڵاتێکی وەکو تورکیا مەسەلەن عێراق بازارێکی زۆر گەورەیە بەنسبەت وان بۆ بیانەوێ پارچە پارچەیکەن ئەگەر تەعامل لەگەر هەموو بازاری عێراق دەکەن. ئێران بە هەمان شێوە عێراق بازارێکی گەورەیە بۆ ئەوان خۆ بەنسبەت وڵاتانی دەرەوەش مەسلەی نەوتی عێراقی هەموو عێراقیان دەوێت نەگی بەشێک لە عێراقیا بەشەکەی تر. مەسلەی ڕەنگە هەندێک کەس باسی تەغیری سیاسی دەکات لە منطقە کە منطقەکە هەمووی ڕەنگە گۆڕانکاری بەسەردا بێ ئەوەشیان هەر تەحلیلاتە یعنی هیچ شتێکی ئەو تۆ نییە بەدەستەوە کە بڵێن ئەو منطقەیە دووبارە وەکو 100 ساڵ پێشێستا لە زمانی سایکس پیکۆ ئیعادەی خاریتەی دەکرێت. تەنانەت مەسلەی سووریا کە تا ئێستا باز دەکرا لە تەقسیمکردنی لە ئاخر اجتماعی ڤێننا کە وڵاتە سلێزەکان هەمویان بەشدار بوون باسییان لەوە کرد کە دەبی سووریاش یەک پارچە بمینێتەوە نەکرد عێراق. سووریا تەنانەت کە خەڵکەی زۆر باسی دابەشبوونی سووریا دەکا بەسەر سێ بەش کورد و عەلەویەت و سوننەکان تاکید لەسەر کراوە. هەندێک خەڵک شەیە کە دێ باسی مەسلەی ئیسرائیل و لە بۆ زەعیفکردنی معارەزەی ئیسرائیل لە وڵاتانی عەرەبی خۆی لە ڕاستەکەی وڵاتانی عەرەبی هەر یەکجار زۆر پێیان خۆیان دابەش بووین و خەتەریش نین لەسەر ئیسرائیل. ئیسرائیل پێویستی بەوەی نییە کەوە زیاتر پارچە پارچەشیان بکار ئەسڵەن وجودی نییە ئەو مەسلەی سڕاع لەگەر ئیسرائیل بەڕێی من چونکە نەماوە. لۆی ئێستا ئەگەر بینە سەر ئەوەی چۆن دەتوێت عێراق دابەش بکەوێت عێراق بەدوونەوە دابەش دەبی دیا لە خەتی تائیفی شیعە و سوننە و کوردستان کە پێی دەڵێن سوننەستان و شیعستان با بڵێن یاوە خود لەسەر خەتی قەومی کوردستان و باقی عەرەبستان یا عێراقی عەرەب لەو دوو خەتە ئەگەر بێت و لە هەمان کاتیش لێرە پێویستمان بۆیە بزانین ئایا بەغداد چی لێدێ لەو معادلەیە. ئەگەر بینە سەر باسی خەریتەی تائیفی عێراق بکەین ئێستا خەریتەکەتان لێ دیارە بەشی سەرەوە کوردستانە لە ناوەڕاستەکەی قاوەیە کە سوننە و عەرەبی تێدایە و دەتوانین بڵێنەوە منطقەی دابڕێنراوەکانە دوایە عەرەبی سوننەت هەیە دوایە شیعەت هەیە و بەشەکیش لە بینیان تێکەڵە. ئەگەر بین باسی سوننەستان بکەین لێرە پێویستە بزانین باسی کام سوننە دەکەین ئێمە سوننەی دیالە سوننەی ئەمبار سوننەی سەلاحەدین یا سوننەی ڕەمادی. ڕاستە ناوی سوننەیەکیان دەخاتەوە بەڵام لە ڕاستیدا زۆر پەرتەوازە. با بڵێن سوننەی سەلاحەدین تەماشاکەین زۆربەی هەرە زۆریان جبورین جبوری عەشیرەتێکی زۆر گەورەیە لە هەموو عێراق ئیمتیداداتیان هەیە بۆ جنوبیش و شیعەشن و سوننەشن. ئەوانە لەگەر حکوومەتی بەغدان بەڕاستی حتا لە شەڕی داعش شەڕێکی یەکجار گەورەی منطقەی سەلاح الدین و تکریت ئەوان کردویانە بۆی ئەوان لەگەر ئەوە نین کەوە سەلاح الدین یەک بگرتەوە ینی ببتە بەشێک لە ئیقلیمی سونە لە دەوڵەتی سونە مەسلەی مووسڵ فەرقیان گەلک زۆرە وەکو خەڵکی مووسڵ لەگەر خەڵکی ئەمبار مەسەلەن خەڵکی ئەمبار عشایر و بەدوونە بەڵام خەڵکی مووسڵ هەمووی زۆربەیان خەڵکی تێگەیشت و لێزان و خەریجی جامعە و زابط بووینە وەختی خۆی و لە ینی مەدەنی بووین زیاتر ئەوانە حتا عەقلیەت و ژیان و ئەفکاریشیان زۆر فەرقی هەیە لەگەر عەرەبی سونەی ئەمبار مەسەلەن دیالە خۆی ئەسڵەن منطقەیەکی زۆر تێکەڵە لە بینی کورد و عەرەب و سونە ئەوانیش زۆر بەیان لەگەر ئەوەنین کە ئیقلیمی خۆیان هەبی تەنانەت توانایەکیان زۆر کەمە تا ئێستاکەش بە تایبەتی کە ئێستا واقع حالێکی تریش پێیا بووە کە مەسلەی دوای شەڕی داعش ئەسڵەن دیالە پاکتاو کراوە خەڵکیی زۆریان تەهجیر کراوە ئێستا شیعە بە شێوەیەکی زۆر کە سەیطرەی کردووە لەسەر دیالە چکە بە خەتەکی گرنگی ئێرانی دەزانن کەواتە ئێمە کە دەین باسی سونە دەکەین دەیبرین کام سونەی کام وڵاتە دوایەوە دەین تەصنیفێکی تریشمان هەیە بۆ سونە ئەو سونانەی کەوا لە ژێر داعشن یا ئەو سونانەی لە دەرەوەی داعشن تو لە مووسڵ لە ئەمبار لەوانە مەناتق زۆر هەیەکەوە داگیر کراوە ئەو سونانەی کە لەوێنە هەندێکیان هەیە دژی داعشن هەندێکیان هەیە لەگەڵ داعش شەڕ دەکەن خۆ ئێستا لێرە لە تەنانەت لە خەتی گوێڕ و مەخمور ئەوانە ئەگەر تەماشاکە ئەوانەی شەڕی پێشمەرگە دەکەن سونەی عێراقین سونەی ئەو منطقەیان دژ بە کورد و دژ بە حکوومەتی بەغدا شەڕ دەکەن هەندێکیش هەیە کە خەڵکە ڕەنگە زۆربەی هەرە زۆری ئەو بابەتە بیکەوە خەڵکە بەدبەختەکەی و لە ژێر داعشە لە ژێر حکوومەتی عێراق بی لە ژێر داعش بی ڕەنگار عینیشتە ئەو زەدەیە سەرەوەی کەوە سونەکانی ترچێن سونەکانی تر ئەگەر یەک سلاید بگەڕێمەوە پاش سونەکانی تر ئەوانەی کە لە دەرەوەن دیسان ئەوانەش تەصنیف دەکرێنەوە بەدوونەوە سنت هەیە لەگەر پرۆسەی سیاسی عێراقیە سنت هەیە لە دەرەوەی پرۆسەی سیاسی عێراقیە لە بەعسیەکانە لەوان یاخود ئەوانەی کە دەرکران وەک ڕافع ئیساوی و ئەوانەی تر کە حکوومەتی بەغدا ڕاوینە ئەوانەش دیدیان جیاوازە بۆ مەسلەی وڵاتی سونەستان یا بۆ مەسلەی عێراق خۆی طبعا سنە مشکلەی تریشان هەیە ئێستا مەسەن کە دەڵی کورد ئەتوو 4-5 کەست دێتە خەیاڵ ئەوانە تەمسیلی قەراری کوردی دەکەن کە ئەوانە بڕیاری کوردیان لەلای ئەگەر بچم لەگەر ئەو 5-6 کەسەدانیشم ڕەنگە من بڕیارێک دەربینم کەوە بڕیاری کووردە لەگەر شیعە بە هەمان شێوە 5-6 کەسەد ڕەنگە بێتە خەیاڵ کە برەی لەگەر ئەوانە قسە بکەم دەتوانم قەراری شیعە وەرگرم بەڵام کە دەی باسی سونە دەکەی قیادەیان نییە سونە وەکو قیادەی تایبەتی خۆیان لۆیە زۆر زەحمەتە دوو قەرارێک دەرکەی کە برێ ئەوانە قەراری سونەیە مەسەلەی تەمسیلی سونە چێ دەیکاتن ئێستا تو لە هەموو یەک لە مشکلە هەر گەورەکانی ئەمریکا کاتێک کە دەیەوێت ئیشێک بۆ سونە بکە نازانی چێ داوەت بکە هەر لایەنەکی داوەت کە 100 کەسی تر لێ هەردەستەوە دەرێەوە تەمسیلی من ناکە من سونە ئەوە مشکلەیەکی تریشیان هەیە وەکو شیعەش نین کەەوە حەوزەیان هەبی یا مەرجعیان هەبی مەرجعی دینیشیان نییە ئەلەوەش هەر پەرتەوازە لە لایەکی تریش ئەتۆ گەر بێی سونە یاخود لە خەتی طائفی ئێمە عێراق دابەش بکەین مجموعەك مناطقت هەیە چیان لێ دەکەین یەک لەو منطقانە ئەعزەمیە لە ناو بەحرێکی شیعە دەژی 500,000 کەسە ئەتۆ ئەگەر بێت و دەوڵەتی سونە دروستکەی ئەو 500,000 کەسە لە ناو منطقەی شیعە لێ دەکەین دەبی تەهدیریان کەین باشە زوبێر چ لێ دەکەیت زوبێر 100,000 کەسن لە ناو جەرگەی بەسڕان محافظەی بەسڕا لە جنوب هەمویان سونەنە ئەوان چ لێ دەکەیت بێ ئەگەر لە سەلاحەدین تەواژاکەی دیالەت بەلەدت هەیە دوجێلت هەیە کە ئەوانە لە ناو بەحرێکی سونە دەژین هەمویان شیعەن تقریبی 40,000 کەس 50,000 کەسەکی لێیە یعنی ئەوەش مشکلەیەکی ترە کە دەی باسی تەقسیمی عێراق دەکەی لە چ خەتێک دەیکەی و چی لەو خەڵکە دەکەی ئەگەر بێت و بینە سەر کوردستان مەجموعەک پرسیار لێرە خۆی فەرز دەکات لە مەسەلەی کوردستان ئایا کوردستان بەفعلی ئەوەی کە برندن باسی دەکات کە کوردستان بەرەو سەربەخۆی بڕوە ئایا ئێمە بەفعلی ئامادەین کە ببینە دەوڵەت ژێرخانی ئابووریمان هەیە ئێستا ئەمە تەنانەت ئەوڕۆ کە باسی ئەوڕۆ دەکەین ئێمە زۆر گرنگە لێرە مۆزوعەکە ئەوڕۆ ئێمە معاشی ئیقلیممان پێ نادرێ باشە تو ئەگەر منطقە دابڕێنراوەکانی بینینە سەر لە ناحیە اقتصادیەکەی چیان لێ دەکەی دەتوانین بیانژێنین ئەوڕۆ ئایا ئەو ئینستیتیوشنانەی کە باسی دەکا هەمانە لێرە دەستمان پێکردێ بە دروستکردنی لە حکوومەت لە مؤسسات ئەوانە پرسیاری زۆر گرنگن کە ئێمە مقەویماتی دەوڵەتمان پێویستە بۆی کوردستان بەفتە دەوڵەت ئەوە پرسیارێکی کە دەبی بکرێ ئایا کوردستان لەو دەقەیە دەکرێتن ئایا کەرکووک دەبتە بەشێک لەو کوردستانە ئەگەر بێت و ئەوڕۆ تەقسیم کرێ چونکە ئەگەر کەرکووکی تێدا نەبی خۆ کورد 100 ساڵە لە ناخۆشیدا دەژی شۆڕش دوای شۆڕژ ئێمە بە کەرکووک کردومانە هەروەک پێشتریش زمانی ڕەحمەتی جەنابی مەلا مستەفاش چەند جار عەرزی ئەوەیان کردێکەوە کوردستانی بدەنا بەڵام بەبێ کەرکووک و ڕەفزی کردیە ئایا ئێستامە دەتوانین بین قبوڵی کەین بەبێ کەرکووک باشە کەرکووچی دەخەیە سەر ئەو مشکلانەی تری دێتە سەر ئایا بەغدا ڕازی دەبی دوێنێ جەنابی کاک نەسیر و جەنابی کاک بەرهەمیش باسی ئەوەیان کرد سەبرندنیش ئەوی کرد کە بەبێ بەغدا زۆر زەحمەتە تو کوردستان بکەیە دەوڵەت کەواتە دەبی بەغدا ڕازی بی لەسەرەوەی کە بەفتە دەوڵەت ئینجا بە نیقاش و بە حیوار و بە هەر شتێکی ترە تورکیا ئێران بە هەمان شێوە بەبێ ڕازیبوونی ئەوان چونکە مشکلەی گەورەی کوردستان لەوەیەکەوە بە ئینگلیزی لاندلۆکت کە ئێمە لە هەر چوار دەورە دراوی مەخرەجێکمان نییە بۆ بەحر بۆ شوێن بۆیە ئەوەش پێویستیمان بە تورکیایە بە ئێرانەیە کە ئێستا تورکیا حلفێک هەیە لە بینیان کە نەوتی کوردستانی پێدەڕوا بەڵام ئەوەش پێویستی بەوەیەکەوە لامان کات بەڕاستی نە رووسیا و نە ئەمریکا و نە وڵاتە جلهێزەکان تا ئێستا کەروەک باسمان کرد نەیانگوتووە کەواتە حەل چی ئەوڕۆ حەلەوەی ئەوڕۆ ئێمە لە چوارچێوەی عێراقین با ئەوەی کە ئێستا لە دەسمانە ئیشی لەسەر بکەین ئەوەش بەوەیەکەوە یەکەم شت پێویستە داعش نەمینە کە پێویستە حکوومەتی کوردستان و حکوومەتی فیدرال و هاوپەیمانەکان هەمویان کار بکەن بۆ ئەوەی کە داعش لە ناو برین داعشمان لە ناو برد پێویست دەکەکەوە نازیحەکان بگەڕێنەوە 1.7 ملیۆن نازیح ئێستا لە کوردستانە کە ئەوە مشکلێکی زۆر گەورەیە بۆ هەرێمی کوردستان و باقیەکەی تریش ئەو کنستیتیوشنەی کە پێشەوە باسی مصالحەی وەتەنی ضرورە کە بە فعلی مصالحەی وەتەنی دروست بێ جینا عێراق بە حیاتی نابتەوە هیچ لە ضمنی مصالحەی وەتەنی کە ئێستا وەرەقەیەکی تەقدیم کراوە مەسەلەی ئۆیل ئەند گاز لۆ مەسەلەی ڕەڤنیو شێرینگ کە ئەوە دەبی تەرتیب بکرێ لە هەمان کات دەبی حکوومەت ببتە لا مەرکەزی حکوومەتی مەرکەزی نایخوا بە حیاتی خۆی بەغدا ناتوانانی زارشتر کۆنتترۆلی هەولێر بکاتەوە بە حیاتی خۆی بەغدا ناتوانانی کۆنتترۆلی مووسڵ یا ئەمبار بکە یا شوێنێکی تر بکاتن لە هەمان کاتیش دەبی مەسەلەی ئەو کۆنستیتیوشنەی برندن باسی کرد دەبی تەطبیق بکرێ بەبێ تەطبیقکردنی ئەوە عێراق زۆر زەحمەتە کەواتە ئێمە ئێستا باسی ئەو ڕۆی عێراق دەکەین کە زۆر زەحمەتە تو بێ تەقسیمی کە ئەگەر ئەو مەشاکلانەی تری بۆ حەل نەکەی بەڵام بۆ کورد دەبی ئیش بکا لەسەرەوەی کە ڕۆژێک ڕۆژان بەفتە دەوڵەت چکە خەونی هەموو کوردیەکە بەڵام بۆ ئەوەی ببینە دەوڵەت دەبی مقەویماتی دەوڵەتمان هەبی نەکشی عاراتمان هەبی پرۆژەمان هەبی پێویستە لە سندخبەی کوردی پرۆژەی دروستکردنی دەوڵەت بخاتە ئەستۆی خۆی پێویستە کە ئەو دەوڵەتە بێتن ئەتو مقەویماتی سیاسی اقتصادی دەولی بۆ دروستکەی ئەو کە بیکێ قەزیەک بیکێ مەشروعەک بیخێ بەردەمی بەغداش و تەهرانیش و ئەستەمبولیش و واشنگتنیش و لەندەنیش و هەموو لایەشتر بەس لە هەمووشی مهمتر بیخێ بەردەستی تاچی کوردی دەبی ئێمە ئەو ڕۆکە ئێستا لەو وەزعی ئێستای کوردستان داین کە پەرتەوازەکی ئەو قەیرانە سیاسی کە ئەو پاژنیوەڕۆ ئەو دیبەیتەی کە هەیە پێویستە ئەو قەیرانە سیاسیە نەمینێ دەبی کەلیمەی کوردی یەکگرتووبی و هەموو کورد دەبی لەگەڵ ئەوە بیتن کە ئەتو ببێ دەوڵەت ئەو کاتە تو دەبێ دەوڵەت ئەجینا زۆر زەحمەت دەبی و زۆر سپاس.
Thank you. Thank you for all our panelists. All three have actually suggested some very good points, and they did not just give us what the problems were, but they also suggested some solutions. For example, Ambassador Faili talked about the three-pronged solution that we need to have in terms of a shared vision, in terms of having the concept of closure, which is very important for us to be able to move forward, and to actually have writing. And then actually having that direction and then working with what it is that we do have today. But my question to you is, Ambassador Faidli, is that what has prevented Iraqi leaders from making the right choices? I mean, all of us do know what the right choices are, and all of us know what the musts and shoulds and needs are. What is it that has prevented the Iraqi leaders from doing so, and how can we actually move beyond those mistakes that have been made in the past?
Yeah. To start with, we have to have a true reflection of why we are where we are. And to do that, we have to admit certain mistakes and share the vision we want to move forward to. At this moment, culturally, it's unacceptable to say, I made a mistake. That's a general, bigger problem we have. At this moment, it's culturally is unacceptable to say, I am not at X, Y, and Z. So at this moment, when you talk about you are an Iraqi will ask you, where are you from? I say, I'm Iraqi, where are you from? You keep saying problems. So at this moment, we are, as a society, by the way, these are all heritage of dictatorship societies. We are short-sighted in what we want. We are certainly do not allow the other to have the breathing space, existence, dialogue to take place. And certainly, for us to move forward, we need to reflect what is needed, not what our people want. Because at this moment, polarization in society is preventing us from having an actual dialogue with somebody away from the media and away from being labeled, you're a traitor, you are X, Y, and Z. At this moment, if you talk against the independent of the Kurds, and I'm a Kurd, I will be labeled straight away, you're a Jash, or you are not patriotic, very similar to anti-Semitism mentality. That's the wrong thing. If you talk about this is from the Kurds, by the way. That's immediately, I get Twitter straight away. I'm sure while I'm talking now, I will get Twitters to that effect. So that's one aspect. And when you talk about with the others, say, well, Shia may rule Baghdad, but they have to bear in mind that the other communities are there. They have to accommodate the other. At this moment, there aren't enough of element of trust. We need to do confidence building measures offline, away from the media, and to have a sensible dialogue as to how do we move. To do that, we need to lead. And at this moment, Iraq, unfortunately, I have to say that openly, we lack founding fathers. We lack leaders who are brave enough to transform the society rather than follow whatever the street is asking them to do.
Thank you. Professor O'Leary, you talked very much about the Constitution and the problem with it's not the Constitution itself, but the actual implementation. And you suggested that the Kurds not accept the way the Constitution has been implemented and should ask for amendments to this Constitution. But as we do know, what has actually happened is having an amendment process in Baghdad has been quite difficult because for the past 8 years, or 10 years actually, they have been trying to amend the Constitution because the Sunnis felt that they actually were not represented in the constitutional writing process. So what kind of things would you suggest that the Kurds actually be very specific in asking for in these amendments? And as you suggested also, the Confederation or having a Confederate system in Iraq and working on a treaty rather than actually having a constitution. I believe it's a great solution, but I think it will be very difficult to pass. So what is it that we can, what is it that the Kurds can actually be very specific in terms asking for, in terms of dealing with Baghdad to try and amend this relationship that has been broken in the last few years?
Thank you very much for your question. I'd like to correct the premise that underlay your question. I don't think it's a worthwhile project to seek amendments of the Constitution. And I think I said that. If I've failed to represent myself properly, I apologize. What I was indicating was it would be so difficult to amend Iraq's constitution in the way that would be required for Kurdistan to ensure total clarity on the questions that matter to Kurds, that it would be preferable for Kurds to seek to change their relationship with Baghdad and switch to a confederal relationship. Now, my argument was that the core benefits of being in a confederal relationship are that you enjoy exactly the same powers as a sovereign independent state. The United Kingdom is part of the Confederation of the European Union. An independent Scotland would be part of the Confederation of the European Union. There is no disjuncture between being independent and being a member of a confederation. The advantage of being in a confederation with the rest of Iraq is that you do have institutional channels to maintain with your former federal partners. You can have a common market. You don't have to have a common currency, but you could have a common market. You can share a whole series of things that matter to you jointly, antiquities. You do have to deal with and resolve the question of the border of southern Kurdistan. That has to be resolved. That could be done more amicably in a confederal environment. It could be done unilaterally, but it could better be done bilaterally. So my argument is that from a Kurdish perspective, the Constitution of 2005 has not only failed to be implemented, it is incredibly unlikely, it is not credible to believe that you can find partners in Baghdad who will implement it. Therefore, think strategically, and the strategic options before you are a move to independence, and I've suggested reasons for saying that you're not quite ready yet for simple independence. Alternatively, go for the confederal strategy. Then the rest of Iraq knows what you want. It's up to the rest of Iraq to decide how it responds to your different approach. I think I heard a whole series of arguments to the effect that one of the reasons for keeping Iraq united are the difficulties of demographic heterogeneity in various parts of Iraq. Now, one of the consequences of war and massive dislocation is that that's no longer true. Populations have fled from all over Iraq. The most heterogeneous part of Iraq is Kurdistan. Why? Because that's where the refugees go. That's where the internally displaced people go. The rest of Iraq is much less secure, particularly for minorities. The idea that keeping Iraq together and a federal Iraq together is better for minorities is one of the most preposterous claims that one could make in the contemporary world. The only place where minorities are safe is actually in the Kurdistan region, and even then, they're not perfectly safe, but they're a lot safer than they are in the rest of Iraq. And indeed, it's part of the argument for confederalizing Iraq is that the Kurdistan region would be the most pluralistic and the best place for the protection of the historic diversity of Iraq, which unfortunately war, internal civil war, and displacements has now rendered much less heterogeneous than it used to be. I shouldn't go on, but I can. But if you'd like to follow up with further questions, I'll be happy to take them.
We'll keep it open to the crowd. I'm sure they will have so many questions on this issue. But Kak Farhad, yesterday we heard Qubat Talabani when he was talking about beating ISIS. He talked about having a strong economy and how that would be the solution for the war against ISIS. In terms of making sure that in Iraq where everybody does feel equal, an Iraq where if it is going to stay together, we really need to look at these economic situations or how to resolve this economic rifts that we have between Kurdistan and between Baghdad. So if you can give us your thoughts on this in terms of how we can economically fix Iraq.
Well, Iraq is facing huge challenges. Among them is the inequality, and when it comes to everything, really. Iraq is in a unique status where nowhere else it's not united, it's not divided, it's not a federal state, it's not a really dictatorship as put it. Iraq is unique in every sense, and the challenges is not only economical, political, and everything else in between is there. And that's the difficulty of really applying any solution. What Brendan talks about confederalism, you need to change the constitution. Changing constitution is near impossible because it's near impossible to get all the Iraqi political leadership to come together and apply, to reach an agreement. They don't agree on almost anything. So the solution is always we talk about it, but it's very difficult to come by because the differences are absolutely massive. In terms of, I think he misunderstood my argument about protecting minority. It was protecting the enclaves within if we divide the country, where you have a place like Zubair, there's 100,000 Sunnis live there. Are you telling me it's preposterous to get these people out of Zubair, or are you going to displace them? Are you going to bring them to Kurdistan, or what? Because this is the major difficulty. It's right on the ground. We are not talking about Christians or Yazidis or Turkmens here. We are talking about massive population that live there, interlocked. Shia and Sunni is not like Kurds and Arabs. The Kurd and Arab divide is very clear. There's a line. But Shia and Sunni, they are interlocked. They're like A'zamiyya. You have 500,000 people live in one enclave. They're all Sunnis. And they live in a sea of Shia populated areas, right in the middle. What are you going to do with that? And Baghdad actually itself is a massively mixed place. So for you to divide Iraq is going to be very, very difficult. And that's the point I'm making here. Unless the world community tolerate massive ethnic cleansing that will go on. Otherwise, it's impossible. Even for the Kurdish areas, some lines are very difficult. The Kurds have to then make a decision, let go of certain area and gain certain others. I mean, somewhere like, for example, if you go to Badr or Jassan, this is historically Kurdish areas. But right now, we don't talk so much about Badr or Jassan. But if you say Khanaqin, for example, then Khanaqin definitely is a totally Kurdish area. But even in Khanaqin, there are Arab areas and Arab populated areas. Kirkuk itself. So what the point here is not that we're making judgment. It's more, this is the status quo. This is what we have in Iraq. And this is what poses the difficulty. It's not an academic study. This is the reality. And if you want to deal with the reality, and deal with it. But it is very, very difficult. And that's the point I'm making. It's not easy.
Thank you. I think before we go to the floor, I think Mr. Faili would like to make some comments.
I think, to be honest, the debate shouldn't be what it is. It should be, what do we get from independent, which we don't have at this moment? How could we work together to preserve the integrity and development of our societies? It's not, I want independent at the cost of anything else, at the cost of my prosperity, the security, coexistence, heritage, and so on. That's the wrong question to ask, because times tells us now that all countries are working toward interdependencies rather than independencies. That's the nature of the globalization and everything else. That's what you have debates in England, you have it elsewhere. We are asking the wrong questions at this time. We need to be asking, how do we preserve the integrity of our people? Not we have to have independent at any cost. That question, that nation-state question, is the wrong question to resolve the issues we are. We may want to agree on whatever vision we have moving forward, but we have to be realistic in the steps we put forward. The co-federation question is, what's in it for Baghdad or Basra? What's in it for Basra to have co-federation? That's a legitimate question to be asked. If we are so narrow-minded in saying it has to be that I'm as a Kurd have independence, what about the Turkmen? What do they say? What about, and we will not finish anywhere. What about those who have an ideology which is outside the ethno-sectarian ideology? What do we do with them? I think it's the wrong question to ask in such a cosmopolitan country at such a time. The question should be, how do we preserve the integrity of our citizens? whatever they are, whatever ethnic sectarian they're from. That's what we need to talk about. That's the dialogue should be. Otherwise, unfortunately, we are doomed and we are against history.
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, I think we talked about preserving the integrity of the people, but some people actually think that preserving that integrity actually is connected to not necessarily keeping the integrity of Iraq, because a lot of people are being killed within those borders.
No, I'm saying it's the wrong question.
But I'm looking around the room and I see a lot of people raising their hands, so let's just give them a chance, and then that'll give you guys a chance to discuss these points. I'm actually going to start, not from the center this time, I'm going to start from this side here. We'll start with Chinar Khan. Chinar Saad, please. You might want to put your headphones on because...
زۆر سپاس تانی خان. من سوال و تێبینیم هەیە بەڕاستی. یەکەم شت دەمێ بەوە دەست پێ بکەم کە مخابن دۆستی ئێمە و کەسێک لە دەرەوەی ئەو وڵاتە زۆر واقعیتر و منطقیتر بیر دەکاتەوە بۆ چارەسەرکردنی کێشەکانی ئەم وڵاتە لەو دوو بەڕێزەی کە ئەندامی ئەو وڵاتن و شارەزای مێژوو جوغرافیا و ئەمڕۆی ئەو وڵاتن. پرسیارێکی نەپرسیار بەڵام تعلیقم لە سەقسەکانی بەڕێز لوقمان فەیلەی. جەنابەت باسی زۆر مهتەمی بە پاراستنی یەکپارچەی عێراق و یەکێک لە ئەدلەکانت فاکتەرەکانت ئەوەیە کە دەڵێ یەکپارچەی عێراق پارێزگاری لە هەمەڕەنجی و کولتور و پێکهاتەکانی وڵاتە دەکات. جەنابەت کوردی فەیلی، من وەزیری شەهیدان و ئەنفاڵکراوەکان بووم. تۆی کە کوردی فەیلی لەسەر ئەساسی ئەم یەکپارچەی ئەم وڵاتە کە هەمومان پێمان وایە مقەدەسە و هاڵەیە و نابێ پێشێل بکرێ بە هەزاران و سەدان هەزاری ئەندامی پێکهاتەکەی تۆ ناسنامەیان لێ سەندراوە بەس لە بەرەوەی فەیلی بوون و بە هەزاران و سەدان هەزار کورد لە بەرەوەی کورد بوون، کوژران، قڕکران، تعریب کران و ڕاگوازران بەس لە بەرەوەی کورد بوون، لە بەرەوەی پێکهاتەک بوون لە وڵاتە. بەدەیان مەسیحی لە ئەمڕۆژدا هەڕەشیان لەسەرە لە بەرەوەی مەسیحین و پەیڕەوی لە دین یا مەسەبێکی تر ناکەن. هەر دوێنێ بوو بە سەدان هەزار ئێزیدیمان بینی کوردی ئێزیدی لە بەرەوەی ئێزیدی بوون چیان بەسەر هات. بۆیە لەم وڵاتە ئەو پێکهاتە یا ئەو یەکپارچەیە کە جەنابەت باسی دەکەی هەمیشە هەڕەشە بووە لەسەر پێکهاتەکانی ئەم وڵاتە و من پێم وایە بە پێچەوانەوە دەبێ ئەرێ پرسیارێک لە جەنابەت دەکەم. یەکپارچەیی لە پێناوی چی؟ من پێم وایە شەڕ و کوشتن و بڕین و قڕکردنی ئینسانەکانی ئەم وڵاتە بەس لە پێناوی یەکپارچەیی عێراق ئەرێ دەوڵەت مقەدەسە یانیش مرۆڤ. بۆیە من پێم وایە دەبێ دابەشبوون لە پێناوی ئیستقرار و خۆشبەختی ئەم وڵاتە بی، نەک پاراستنی بەس یەکپارچەیی لە پێناوی ئەوەی کە وڵاتە و میلەتە و پێکاتەیە هەمیشە بمرن بکوژرێن و ئەم خاکە
ببوور ئەگەر پرسیارێکت هەبوایە بەس تاریخەکە بوو تکاتان لێ دەکەم ئەگەر بۆی مەجالەکەمان زیاتر هەبێ بۆ مناقەشە ئەگەر پرسیار هەبێتن نەکو تعلیق و کۆمنت بێتن بۆی بتوانین مەجالیش بدەین ئەو برادرانش بڵامی پرسیارەکان بدەنەوە. ئەلێرانەوە دەچمە فەرموو لە پێشەوە بس أجر برسيار ببي زحمة.
Question for the whole panel, but Brendan in particular. Does Confederation require a lesser degree of international recognition?
Okay, so Spas, we're going to take another question here. We actually have a couple of questions. What we're going to do is we're going to take most of the questions at the same time. Kak Ismail. Do you need to write this down because I'm not going.
شكرا. سؤالي هل هو مبرر يعني خروقات النظام السابق وصدام والاعتداءات وما حدث في العراق أن يكون هو هذا المبرر الحقيقي حتى نذهب إلى التقسيم في هذا البلد؟ هذا سؤال. لكن تعليقي أحتاج إلى إذا هناك وقت تسمحي لي ست تانية. السنة يعني بالذات وضع السيد فرهاد يعني قسم هذا الموضوع، أنا أتفق معه على هذا الوصف، وأتفق مع الأخوة ما طرحوه في كل طروحاتهم. لكن السنة واحدة من الأسباب يعني وضعنا وتخلخلنا هو عدم وجود مرجعية. نعم وصف دقيق. نحن لم نعتمد على الدين وعلى المذهب في اتخاذ يعني قدوة لنا. نؤمن انه
وصلت الفكرة. اذا حتى نعطي المجال اذا اكو سؤال رجاء.
العرب سألت هذا السؤال، لكن العرب في العراق
شكرا
حريصين على الكرد، ونحن حريصين على البقاء في حياة مشتركة مع شعبنا الكردي في هذا البلد، وهذا مبدأ وحريصين جدا عليه وسنحافظ عليه.
شكرا
مع احترامنا للكرد في تقرير المصير وفي مستقبلهم، كل هذه الأمور نؤمنها، لكن حريصين على مشاركتنا معهم في هذه الحياة.
زور سباس. We'll take another question from here. Beriwan Khan.
Thank you, Ms. Tanya Khan. Actually, as we know, Iraq has been the top priority for the world's superpowers since the First World War. The United States intended to keeping Iraq together, as well as the surrounding countries. What I understood from your discussions, the panel, most of them are not with dividing Iraq into different parts, as well as changing or revising the constitution. Actually, our constitution has been prepared as a federal government, for a federal government. What's happening, Iraqi leaders never think of federalism. They think centralized. So what's your opinion, what's your advice for Iraqi leaders to change their approach in running this country towards a federal government? Thank you.
Actually, I think we'll stop with this round of questions and we'll give the panelists a chance to answer, and then we'll go and take some more questions again.
So to start with, as a Faili, by the geography of it, I'm not in Kurdistan, I'm more in Baghdad or other places. So the issue of whether there is Kurdistan or there isn't is irrelevant to my situation. I have other problems to deal with, which is with this, how do I deal with the central state or the geography of the areas where we are in. So in relation to whether there's Kurdistan or not, it's irrelevant. However, I was abused as a community because of the state disrespect to the citizens of their state. Since I'm a citizen, I need to be I need to be protected by the state and my rights preserved. That didn't take place. So here we have a problem of rule of law and the state respect for citizens' rights. Wherever those citizens, wherever the background of those citizens, whether they are Christians in Basra or they are minorities or they are whatever they are, that's where we need to talk about. We need to talk about how do we agree on the rights and responsibilities of citizens and respect of law, rule of law, regardless of your ethno-sectarian background. To do that, we will be in a much better position than trying to straitjacket people that you are a Sunni, therefore you have to be ruled by a Sunni. Well, he said, I was born a Sunni, but that's nothing to do with my beliefs or my outlook and so on. So to that effect, we are literally against the nature of humans' development in what we're talking about here. We're trying to straitjacket people's where in reality people are talking about globalization, virtual cultures, and so on. So to that effect, I think we need to be more open-minded is what's taking place, and less sort of narrow-minded. The relation to Saddam's crimes, nobody is denying that. That's a stage we were in. The state has to take responsibilities for those crimes, yes. But to move forward, we need to have a sense of closure so that we can have new issues in relation to our future. rather than look at the back all the time. What we are doing now is more or less, I'm driving a car and I'm looking at the rear window or mirror and driving the car. I'm not looking at the whole mirror in front of me, but I'm looking at the rear mirror of the car and driving forward. That, unfortunately, is not the right way. And federalism, decentralization, co-federalism is the right solution to move forward. What I'm saying is we need to have the right culture promoted to get to that stage. To do that, we need to substantially do a lot of source searching in our current basic assumptions and how do we want to interact with each other. The other might be a minority in Kurdistan, or might be a certain party in Kurdistan, or might be a minority elsewhere.
Thank you. There was a question.
Thank you for the range of questions. I will try and answer them as briefly as I can. First of all, the lady who spoke at the front. One of the subjects that I study is what causes federations to fail. In general, the prime cause of collapse of federations that are multinational in character is efforts at re-centralization. And you can describe what happened in Iraq since 2005 as a project of re-centralization primarily led by the Dawa Party and its subsequent incarnation in state of law. The prime breakup of federations is not caused by minorities who seek secession, but those who re-centralize, break the federal compact, and break the rights of minorities. That's exactly what's happened to Kurdistan. The question that Kurdistan must ask itself, and that was the basis of my talk, does it have any reasonable evidence to believe that the world of 2005, as promised in the text, can be made real? And my view is no. There's no realistic basis for thinking that among the Arab Iraqi political elite, as elected, there is any prospect of a serious federalization of the country as a whole. The second question that was posed, in effect, by my colleague on the left, was to worry about the fate of Sunni and Shia minorities in Arab Iraq if Kurdistan is either a confederal state or an independent state. Well, frankly, nothing about the existing federal state of Iraq since 2005 did anything for the Sunni and Shia minorities in the wrong places in Iraq. And it was since 2005 that we've had the most comprehensive sectarian cleansing in the history of Iraq. So there is no reason to believe that the presence of Kurds in the federal government or the presence of the Kurdistan region has done anything to mitigate in any serious way the extraordinary divisions between Sunni and Shia Arabs. And I would argue that it is not Kurdistan's role to be a permanent midwife or a permanent therapist for the conflict between the Sunni and Shia Arabs. And it is reasonable for Kurds to consider looking after themselves. Now, the trickiest question I received was, will it be easier for Kurdistan to be recognized as a confederal entity, and if Iraq confederalizes, than if Iraq were to become independent? And my answer to that is yes, and I can give you a very clear precedent. Both Serbia and Montenegro were part of the Yugoslav Federation. They renegotiated their relationship to being one of a confederation after previously being in a federation. The rest of the world treated that confederation as the successor state to the Yugoslav Republic. And that's exactly how I would foresee things happening internationally. If Kurdistan renegotiates its relationship with the rest of Iraq in a confederal fashion, and it doesn't matter whether that's with the whole of what is now Arab Iraq, or whether it's with a separate Sunni state and a separate Shia state and a separate Baghdad state, it doesn't matter. The entire entity would be the successor state from the point of view of international law, and each of its constituent units would have recognized each other as sovereign entities, including sovereign entities with the right of independence. So I think it does make the task of recognition easier. It's easier for the neighbors to deal with. They know that there's going to be a continuation of networks and relationships. The external border is not being challenged in any important way. So it's an easier world for both Turkey and Iran to deal with.
Thank you. If you have actually, do you mind if we just let Kak Farhad and then we'll take another, because of the time, very quickly.
No, very fast. You have the Bashir and Talafar, who are two towns, primarily Turkmen, primarily Shia. The problem we have created as a result of, forgive me for using such words, narrow-mindedness, is that we've created now a problem between the Shia communities, not Arab Shia, and the Kurds. To whose advantage, if I'm a Kurd, and I'm a Kurd, is that I say I'm creating problems with my Shia communities, and bearing in mind that already would lead to the Iranian Shia and other Shia. So I think we need to think more than the binary view of Kurds versus Arabs and vice versa. I think that's a self-destruct button we should not press.
Mr. Ambassador.
Two couple of quick comments. What Brendan said, I think you're inserting something I never said. In terms of my worry about the ethnic cleansing that goes between Sunnis and Shias, if we divide Iraq along the sectarian line, not the ethnic line. If there is a Sunni state and the Shia state, then this is what you're going to worry about. As an academic, I would pose that question to you. Would you worry about that or not? And that's not because of Kurdistan goes independent or not. If we divide Iraq along the ethnic lines, Kurds and Arabs, no, this is not my worry. My worry is completely somewhere else. And my worry would be about are we ready as an independent state? And مخابنكي چنار خان من بداخل كجنابد أو تصور كتبه أو من خمك وفرهات باورناكم هيك كز لهمو كردستان بقدر من ساوي لو يبي كرد ببتدولت أجر زنابد وايت يجيش بي بالتأكيد ديارة خلالك الله منك تعبيرك بتواوينا هاد بي بلام ليرة من بواقعي تماشى موضوع كذا كم كردستان بوي بفت دولة دبي مشروعي دولة مان هبي مشروعي دولتيش بيوستي ببنمايا أمن برسيارك لزنابش تو لهمو نخبي كردي دكم إيما أورو أو لحظية مشروع يعني بنماي بوني بدولة مان هي أنا مشاكل كان هم دزانين ليرة زور قرنجة بواقعي تماشاي إما تماشاي موضوعي بدولة بون بكين لقر واقعي أو روي كردستان وعراقش تعامل بكين لسر أساسا هنقاوي داهاتو من بنين ليرة مسألة مزايدة كردنية ولها مان كاتش مسألة لويدانية آية دكريا ناكريا هیچ شتێک مستحیل نییە.
زۆر سپاس. دەتوانم مناقشە دوای ئەم جارەیان با لە پشتەوە دەست پێ بکەین هەندێک پرسیارەکانی پشتەوە وەربگرین. فەرموو وەڵاهی ببوورە ئەو برادەرەی پشتەوە بزانم دەستی لێوە دەست پێ دەکەین. بەڵام تکایە بەس ئەگەر پرسیارت هەبێت چکو ئەگەر کۆمنت بێتن I'm going to cut you off because we don't have a lot of time. I'm already going over my time. So please only if you have a question and who you're going to pose it to in the panel.
پرسیارم هەیە بەڵێ. پرسیارەکە ئەوەیە ئەگەر دوورێگەم لەگەڵ عێراقمانەوە یاخود ببین بەتەنیا کامە ڕێگا نزیکترە بۆی بیکەین ئینتیزاری میلەتێک بکەین زۆری لە خوارەوەی عێراق کە لە مەوزوعی پێکەوەژیان تێبگەن کە لەوانەیە 20 ساڵی بوێ یاخود ڕێیەکەیت کە هەڵبژێرین کە لەوانەیە هەندێک موشکیلەمان هەبی بەس کامیان نزیکترە. زۆر سپاس.
زۆر سپاس. We'll take a question from the back here. Again, please a question, no comments.
Sorry. Two very quick questions. One is to Kak Farhad. If you look back 110 years, there were only 25 states around in the world. And now you have 200, roughly. And it's not made by intervention. When states fail, that is the mechanism it goes. So why are you not allowing yourself thinking along those directions. You don't need a sponsor when the state fails. It becomes a reality. My question is for Brendan. Brendan, I know very well that you have looked at South Sudan. They went through Confederation, built into the Sudanese constitution, and then they went for independence. And as you know, we talked about it this morning, until now they have signed 7 peace agreements and a civil war, a bloody civil war, although they had all the good conditions we theoretically expect. With that, how is that related to a Kurdistan option?
Okay, we'll take the mic here, please. A question, please.
هيك بوكاك فرهاد نموني ولاتي كبوبا ولات بيرفكت ولا همر يكو انجابو بولاتي يعني شكو بيما او بروسيكي بردوامه بوكاك لقمان لسر اوانيك او برزه باسي كر كدستوري عراق يعني من اظن كوتايبي هاتو كاوينوت يعني اول شيء هيج افاقك لبردمانيه او هيك قسمان لابل لسر كردكاني عراق برامبر بهلوستان برامبر بكرد اي افاقك هي تصورك عراق هربيه قرتوي بمينته يعني تشد مبررك هي لبردما يعني دليلك هي كبتوانين عراق بيه قرتوي بمينته وصفاس.
We will take 2 more questions. I'm going to take 1 question from here. This gentleman who is very eager to speak. Very quickly, please, and a quick question, then we'll take 2 more questions from that side.
Confederation with Iraq, confederation with Iraq is logical. Well, we don't know where the conflict between Shia and Sunni will take Iraq. من كومنتك هي لسر بسيارة كرد كومنت اللي سر قسكاني الدكتور فرهاد على الدين يعني استا أراستيج لكردستان دروس بوا
زور سباس أجا كومنت به أطواني لدواي بانالا كبي بلاي زور سباس دكم دور دواني بردك I have to be fair to the others as well.
همو يعني اعتراف دوليش بيش وقت ما
زور سباس thank you for the comment. Okay, we're going to take 1 question from the back there. Kakiwa, sorry, Kakiwa in the back. And Kakiwa, please, if it's a question.
It is a question with a very, very short intro. The failure of Iraq, I think the Kurds should not say, stand away from this. The Kurds contributed a great deal to the writing of the constitution. But then after that, the application of the Constitution is a process that takes 2 to tango. It doesn't, what we did the Constitution and took a step back. At this stage, I don't know how many cases are in the federal court, for example, about breaches, Kurdish complaints in the court, Kurdish cases about the breaches of the Constitution. The application of the Constitution should have been done by the Kurds, but the problem was the Kurdish representatives in Baghdad are still unclear. Are they representing the Kurdish region, or are they partners in the running of the country that is based on this constitution?
Thank you.
My question here on Kurdish independence, looking at it practically today, the independent Kurdistan will be bordered by ISIS. It won't be bordered by the friendly Shiite state, and it will be bordered by a country that thinks of the Kurds as terrorists, and another country, Iran, as we heard this morning, that sees the Kurds as drug dealers.
Thank you.
Now, what are the viability of such a state?
Thank you. Thank you, Kakiwa. This is the last question we will have to take. I do apologize, unfortunately, this gentleman here, and this will be the last question. But please, question, a very quick question.
سؤالي للسيد بريندن ألا تعتقد أن إغفال أو تغييب الخصوصية التاريخية للجغرافيا السياسية لكردستان الوطن وليس العراق الدولة أدى إلى الغموض في الدستور العراقي، حيث ساوى الدستور بين محافظة عراقية وإقليم كردستان كجغرافيا وكجغرافيا سياسية. يعني هذا الإغفال أدى إلى الغموض. وشكرا.
Did you? Okay. So we'll give you each about 2 minutes to answer, but before I do this, I have a gentleman who's asked me to speak for 1 دقة. أجر جنابت والله بداولي بردناكم لبركاته كمان أجر زور بكرتي he wants to make a comment and then we'll break for lunch. Yes. بزور بخيراي بوي بتوانين كاتبين برادرانش والله عم بدناو.
باش من رجب كاكين لدى قوقاتو بكوريش قساكم من بصراحة زور بزين بما مصطفى لقمان وما مصطفى فرهاد دس خوشيش لما مصطفى براستي نازانم او على خيانتي كردو تعبير ليم يعني خوي نيويرا او براس تربيلي يعني صريح ما بس بلاداني غير رواكا من نازانم باس عراقي ككريا عراق خوي ثماني سطو يك صالة لصال شواردو اگر حسابي بكين عراقي هبوه لنخشك وانا كان بيوتراو عراقي عجمي وعراقي عربي وكردستاني شبوه دواتر هاتنا ببينو برو بتفليدان نقبل لزقوسي كوتين عراقي كان دروس كردوها او عراقيشا هلا صال شواردوا كوتوة جاني هاولاتي كاني خوي بعربي سنو بمسيحي وبكرد وبع همو بيكاتا كانيوا تا امروكا اميش هر امانيوا قربانيا كاني دستي او عراقين امانيوش بيك بارشي بمينيتو وكو عملية انتحارية استاكا باسيا كين اما برسياركن يا ماما برسيارك اوان ولا قصنا كردن باش
برسيارك بزور بخيراي
برسياركي من اوي امانتن وميديان هي بو عراقي كباسيا كان اذا ما دن بانتحار يعني انا ولا دايق بينوا
زور سباس